Hello, I am Singh. Welcome to Authors Club LitLunch Online. This is coming from you from rather strange places, but appropriate for a travel writer. Today we have Julian Sayarer, and we will be talking about his fifth book that is 50 miles wide. And let me first introduce Julian to you. Julian won the Authors Club Stanford Dolman Travel Book of the Year Award in 2017 for Interstate, which was an account of a hitchhike journey through Middle America. In his previous books, he has mapped the modern city from perspective of a bicycle messenger, traveled by boat to remote islands in Asia to chronicle a world and people at the edge of modernity, and described breaking a world record for circumnavigating by bicycle through 20 countries in 169 days. In 50 Miles Wide, Julian pedals on the roads of Israel and occupied Palestine. On his way, he speaks with Palestinian hip-hop artists who wonder if music can change their world, Israelis hoping that kibbutz life can, and Palestinian cycling clubs determined to keep on riding despite army checkpoints and settlers that bar their way. I thoroughly enjoyed Julian's book. It's a very, very different take on Israel and occupied Palestine. It also gives you a very different view, and I can only recommend you read this. This is brilliant. So welcome, Julian, to our rather odd lunch. Shall I ask you by possibly reading us an extract?
Yeah, certainly. Thank you for having me as well. I was saying it's kind of a less charming way of doing it than cycling down to Whitehall and joining you guys for lunch, but it's still nice to speak to you all, even vicariously. I've got an extract to read for you. That's from one of the first moments of crossing from sort of the Israeli side of the 48 armistice line into the West Bank. And it's a sort of, in my standard sort of style, a bit of a meditation on the landscape and seeing it from bicycle and how that informs the writing method. So, yeah. Again, the herd of goats watch me watching them. Those on the edge of the flock look fearfully at me, this possible predator, standing beside another possible predator, less familiar and with two wheels. I see eyes, shining black as jet, set on each side of the head, so that a goat can see in panorama and detect threats approaching as it grazes. And I wonder if the goats detect that my eyes are in the front of my head, targeted and precise in their vision, inadvertently revealing my distant history as a carnivore, a hunter who once had to track his prey and strike. One intrepid goat moves a little towards me, pushes out of the herd of shining eyes. The animal waits, watching me, then startles at the sound of a falling rock behind and runs on thin legs back to that stream of goats flowing over the road and away. Picking up my bicycle, returning to its wheels, finally momentum comes to my pedaling and I begin to move. The land at last gives me its rhythm, puts patience in my head and cadence in my legs, offering the small magic of the world that is all it ever takes to remind you. Take your time, enjoy. I look down between my forearms and handlebars at my turning feet. Here is the desk where I get most of my work done. Here is where I feel thoughts most keenly, and so here is where I write, where sentences form as regular as the wheels turn. In the deep blue sky above, as I round a high hillside, there is a silver flash, and tethered to that sky, the plump body of a blimp comes into view. Floating there, above a small military building, it gathers surveillance images of the goats and the shepherds going about their lives. Close around the bend comes the throb of engines, and I see soldiers packed into a sand-coloured jeep, wearing shades, the beat of the V8 engine leaping from under them as the boys have a whale of a time. For a split second, I see them before the jeep passes, each smiling face like a Boy Scout with hardware, kids sent out to earn the battle-tested badge for which Israeli military products, having already been trialled in Palestine, command a price premium. There were times, riding through the West Bank, when I would consider how the Arabs of Palestine, for all that they had it bad, at least were lucky in that they didn't have to worry about being invaded by the United States. And then I'd pass a military jeep with its smiling teenage soldiers in their sunglasses, and I'd realise that they perhaps felt that they already had been. As I ride, frustration weighs me down, pulls me backwards, for often it feels like the occupation is designed in such a way that will kill all hope. With the guns in the jeep, the military eyeball lurking above the olive trees and watching everything, the totalitarian presence leaves me more than once, asking what use there is in even writing any of it. And then I pedal forward, that motion by definition optimistic, and again I realise that there is nothing for it but to keep on trying. Left I bank down into the next turn, around the terraced hillside and into warm sunshine, and I see the chain turn over again, reminding me quietly that I know no other way than this. Up and over the crests of the hills, I rise on the air currents and then blow back down, carefree for a while, and every child shouts hello and the old man calls out welcome. Sweat runs in my eyes, vision blurring, sun and mist pour down over a countryside where recent rains evaporate towards the sky. Far into the distance, I see the land like a milky white sea, the backs of many hills rising at the surface just barely, as if whales lifting out above and then slouching back beneath the waves. That was a sight to behold, that late afternoon, where one after another and endlessly repeated, I saw for the first time the magic of those hills of Palestine. Immersed in them, I rode upon their rising and falling heartbeat, until it was not a landscape that I rode through, but a cardiogram, where up and down my emotions they sank and soared. That afternoon, I think I understood how it could be that those Palestinians I met, none of whom had ever lived in their own independent country, could still feel with such strength the freedom that was in their spirit. Because to sense freedom is like seeing a person you love out of the corner of your eye and for only a moment in a crowded room. You still recognize them.
Thank you for that. I think that really captures the essence of that book. And I've read your work before, and what struck me is that you've always mixed travel, experience, this very acute sense of aesthetics with politics. But I suppose it's partly to do with where you're writing and what you're writing about. This really, the politics are so foregrounded. Would you tell us a little bit about how this book came about and how this new, well, I can't say new, but how this balance shifted in your writing?
Yeah, I mean, I think I've always, whether I'm cycling on the A roads of the UK or whether I was cycling around the world and through Uyghur in northwest China, I've always seen politics at the roadsides. You can't help but do so when you travel these sort of vast distances slowly by bicycle. So it's always been kind of a big part almost of my writing practice. I'd go so far as to say that. And then in 2017, I suppose is the sort of more definitive start to the idea, in that I was talking about Interstate, the hitchhiking book that you mentioned earlier, at the Edinburgh Festival, and there was an Israeli author also at the festival. She'd written about her, sort of auto-fiction, but a kind of a story of her romance with a Palestinian man. The book was banned in Israel for promoting assimilation, air quotes and all. And so, yeah, she was talking about that work of hers and was very kind of captivated by this notion of politics at the side of the road. And I think from there, it just, it became one of those ideas that you have as a sort of idle musing that seems like a good idea. And I'm half Turkish, and Palestine is, it's such a global liberation struggle. And certainly I think if you are in any way from or of the Middle East, or whether you have any sort of Muslim identity or a Middle Eastern identity, or you're concerned in the UK about prevalent Islamophobia, it sort of feeds into so many kind of dominant and troubling discourses and issues that we're currently facing. So I suppose, I really wanted to take this, this method of riding the bicycle, which somehow kind of brings out the best in people, and I do think it probably gave me a slightly more generous impression of some of those Israeli conscript soldiers that I would have happened across in the West Bank, and equally the Palestinian cycling community that I was fortunate enough to ride with at times, and to see similarly their love of riding a bike, which is really how I came to start traveling by bicycle, and then occupied Palestine, that very pure and innocent right, essentially, to just enjoy riding a bicycle is constantly obstructed by the architecture of the occupation, whether that's formal military checkpoints or informal settler attacks on mountain bikers. And yeah, the bicycle really brings home the geography of it all, because you see everything up close and kind of at a steady pace under human power, which sort of makes it all the more confronting when you're moving yourself through this landscape and you see this man-made architecture that's been constructed to stop movement.
Well, I think there are two things that really struck me. One, this constant juxtaposition, as you rightly noted, between the architecture of occupation that is intended to stop movement. But I think the other thing that struck me was just, for what is such a terrifying, such a long-standing occupation, this is an extraordinarily joyful book in weird moments, and it comes, that was something I wasn't expecting. I wasn't expecting the hope, but more than that, I wasn't expecting the joy, that kind of these moments of just bright, sparkling fireworks like freedom and just laughter and happiness. And
yeah.
How does that play out? How did you find it? How did you come across it?
Yeah, I mean, I don't really, all I could ever hope to do in any writing really is to conduit what you find, I suppose. So, and I agree with you that I think there are moments that are utterly joyful, and I hope that I wrote them well, but for the most part can't really take any credit for as much, because essentially, and it's kind of famed, and it's dangerous to make it too renowned, but Palestinian resilience and determination and absolutely immutable sense of their rights is an inspiration. And it is wrong of the outside world to take that absolutely inspiring and optimistic and principled resistance and understanding of their own freedom, despite being denied it in the architecture of the land, is wrong to take that for granted. And I think for decades after decades, it's become, the situation on the ground has been so stagnant because the Palestinian cause has been, within Palestine and without, globally, through the Palestinian diaspora and those working in solidarity with them, it has been kept alive, and you do feel it. And so on some levels, you're kind of conscious of the fact that the occupation will crumble in one way or another, that I think any kind of totalitarian infrastructure or architecture, and the occupation is exactly that, is not as strong as the raw human need and desire and impulse to be free, to live free, and to live life free, whether that's in the act of riding a bicycle or pursuing your music career as a hip hop artist, and seeking to communicate what is there in your soul to the outside world. And I, for the most part, just count myself really fortunate to have been able to spend that time in Palestine, and to have been met and welcomed by Palestinians that spoke to me in that way. And I think, to be honest, while I agree with you that it is kind of confronting and surprising in a wonderful way, that there is that resilience and spirit, it almost speaks, the surprise almost speaks to the sort of dehumanization of Palestinians, because actually we're so, in some ways, as someone who's obviously supportive of the Palestinian cause, who's half Turkish and has some kind of empathy with the region, the fact that I can be something like a halfway spokesperson for Palestinians is obviously not bad, but there's such an absence of Palestinians, especially Palestinians currently living in Palestine, who can, even if I can put it into sort of literature speak or political science speak, I don't think I can put as compulsively and compelling a case for the Palestinian right to just ride a bicycle without a military checkpoint than Saddam from Hebron, who has to worry about refilling his water bottle because soldiers harass him if he stops at a certain spot on the road. Yeah. So yeah, I think a lot of it's about listening to Palestinian voices and then doing all one can to sort of share what platforms we have with them, I think, and hopefully the book can be part of that. It's been really kind of edifying and really fulfilling to have people respond to it so well. And prior to everything being locked down somewhat, there was a plan for me to lead a tour in Palestine, a cycling tour, so I'm still hoping that can come about. And it's been really heartening to see so many people interested in that. So I think it's about movement building, and essentially the Palestinian struggle is one for the rule of law, for basic human rights, due process, and the rule of law to be upheld and honoured. And I think that becomes an increasingly universal theme and struggle, and the Palestinians have been fighting that struggle since 1948, essentially. So.
It's quite curious because it actually, when I was reading your book, it made me go back to pick up Raja Shahadeh's book from 2007, Palestinian Walks, which is another one that kind of it has that sense of place and a focus on the people and the struggle and the politics of it, but that really palpable sense of what it is to be in Palestine, to be Palestinian. And in some ways, what really struck me about yours, and I suppose this also links back to Interstate, is your ability to talk to people and really draw out some really interesting characters in your journeys, and quite insightful words and ideas that come out of these people. And whether it was the truck driver in Interstate, or here's a Palestinian hip hop artist, but there's so many characters. If you had to pick your favorites from this book, who would be some of the people you really enjoyed, or it was really incredible to have those conversations with?
I mean, I think the key one that I'd always come back to probably forever will be Saddam, the young cyclist from Hebron. And I mean, you use the word conversation there, and he spoke no English and I speak no Arabic, really. Our conversation was little more than holding up the number of fingers to indicate like 33 kilometers between Hebron and Bethlehem. But then the conversation was essentially in riding bikes together and understanding the rhythm of one another and just enjoying doing that together. And yeah, it was a kind of late evening, and I was on with my touring bike and bags, and he was on his road bike all in Lycra, so he was very much setting the pace and ahead of me. And I think actually that distance of actually watching him from behind, and we'd been kind of hanging around in Hebron for a while and finally got round to riding, and to watch him ride was just absolutely kind of, he was set free from this like quite sort of dull, sort of stultifying afternoon indoors with this really heavy heat. He was breaking out from that onto the road, but then of course with the sort of wider metaphors of the book and the bicycle, it's it was, to look at him, it was impossible to believe that this guy isn't free, and in his heart he is free, that, which is I think the political challenge is to make a political reality that reflects the sense of freedom that Palestinians do already feel and are attached to, but currently have to dig quite deep to sort of realize that reality. So yeah, that was a really amazing, like 35 kilometers, so yeah, 20 miles or so together, but it was a very memorable one. And he explained how there's this assumption in both the occupied territories and in Israel proper, within its borders, that if you're on a bicycle, you're Israeli. Well, I guess in Israel proper, that goes without saying. But within the occupied territories, there's an assumption that you're Israeli if you're on a good bike wearing lycra. And a lot of the Palestinian lads who do just love cycling, and women for that matter, although not as many in number, get this kind of momentary bicycle privilege at the checkpoints because it's assumed that they're Israelis. So talking to Saddam about the fact that he was able to ride clear through the occupied territories and into Israel just by the force of kind of entitlement to the road and taking advantage of this profiling that goes on with cyclists was really, yeah, there's a great little subculture amongst the Palestinian cycling community. And I think bikes in general, they are kind of a common language. And that whether you grew up in the Midlands, as I did, cycling in the lanes, or if you're growing up in Hebron, it's kind of this vehicle that is quite simple, quite affordable, and allows you to really break out of wherever you're at and feel that you kind of, the world's yours a little bit.
I'll remember that, bicycle privilege.
Yeah, something of that.
One we haven't kind of come across, but that's really quite an interesting one, this idea of how we are perceived rather than, and how so much of our freedoms or lack of them are linked to perception rather than necessarily, of course they're enforced and physically, but that gray space of... Yeah.
I mean, it's kind of a common issue at checkpoints that actually, if you have privilege, you can go right through them. The settlers wouldn't even, essentially they're security apparatus. So if you were to follow the rule of the law. And so the Israeli military should also really be stopping settlers as well. And of course they're not, because that's not the reality of it. But that kind of entitlement with which a settler approaches a checkpoint and rolls right through, it's not a legal entity. There's no document for it. It's just pure entitlement. And obviously a Palestinian cyclist has to sort of accumulate a certain amount of courage and disregard for consequences, and maybe humor, or whatever you want to call it in the first place, to say, well, I'm just going to do it. And, it's wonderful. I mean, I shouldn't make light of it too much. I mean, just the other week, there was a big story out of the Palestinian cycling community of a bunch of mountain bikers who've been beaten up by settlers on the trails, had their bikes smashed up, and everyone kind of in a bad way. And I had heard stories about that kind of thing being threatened from cycling friends. So even with this kind of tenacity and courage, there are still the sort of obstacles and the harassment and the risks.
I'm going to try wrapping it up, partly because I'm just slightly worried that we might be losing you on the bandwidth on your end. And so my last question is, I suppose my last question, but we could have a couple more here. What next? I mean, it just feels like, where do you go after this? This is such an incredible book.
I mean, I've for the last 10 years been spending a lot of time in Istanbul and Athens and the Balkans. So I'm working on refugees and migration and financial crisis and the fallout of Western foreign policy in the Middle East a lot. So I think, and my own family history as well. My grandfather would have been from a Turkic village within modern day Greece at the end of the Ottoman Empire. So would have been migrated back to Anatolia. So these kind of stories of migration and movement have been really close to what I've been working on for a while now. So, yeah.
Well, we look forward to this. I always sort of think that, what more could you do? And then you do. So thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you for anyone who's tuning in to watch.